But just to cover some housekeeping before we start, welcome to today's show and tell, where we're going to showcase the work we've been undertaking with Waltham Forest as part of the GovTech Catalyst programme to look at transforming housing monitoring. And I'm Kate Taylor, the lead digital planning at CPC. Just some quick housekeeping before we start going through the agenda. If you have any issues with Zoom, please visit the CPC webpage and you can actually watch the event live. And just so you all know, the event is being live streamed and recorded. So Youssef, if you could switch to the next slide. So for the agenda for today, first of all, we're going to be hearing from Oliver Norman, who is one of the challenge owners at London Borough of Waltham Forest. And he's going to be giving us an overview of the context of the project, the funding streams, and the specific challenge within Waltham Forest. We'll then move on to a showcase from the project team on the project. So we've got myself, Youssef, who's one of our data engineers, and Dominica, who's our design researcher. We'll then move on to Q&As from the audience to answer different questions. And our project partners, Atkins, will be joining us for this section, as well as Waltham Forest. For the Q&A part of the session, just so you're aware, please use the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. We'll be monitoring these throughout, and then we'll ask them after the presentation. We'll aim to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the event. If we don't get to them all, we will do a Q&A response to everyone after this session. And just so you know, because sometimes people don't realise we're doing this, sometimes we will paraphrase questions if, say, 5 or 6 people have asked a very similar question to combine some of them. So thank you everyone for joining. I think we now have quite a lot of the participants online. So I'm just gonna hand over to Ollie from Waltham Forest, and I'll switch myself off so he can give us an overview of the challenge and the context in Waltham Forest.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, so we're really excited to be able to share with you today some of the work which we've been doing since the end of last year, really, with the Catapult as part of our GovTech Catalyst Challenge. At the outset, I think the GovTech Catalyst team over at GDS for seeing the potential really in the bid which we wrote over a year ago and considering it worth funding. So with a 15th project funded in a programme of challenges across a whole range of areas, all proposed by the public sector, and the criteria really being that they need to have the potential to be addressed by innovative technology. And so the challenge which we proposed was titled, "How might we accelerate the building of new housing using better geospatial information?" And as part of that, we ran an SBRI competition last summer and received over 30 applications, from which we selected the best 5, who we've been working with since December, in a kind of hybrid discovery alpha phase 1. And I hope that in time, those of you who are interested to join us today will get to see some of the outputs from the other 4 supply teams, which together we think have the potential to really make considerable strides towards addressing the challenge. But what is the challenge? The origin of it, as we specified it, was kind of born of reflection on some of the inadequacies and inefficiencies really with the current system of monitoring. Monitoring and the monitoring of housing delivery in particular is a key part of the planning process. It enables us to take decisions that are well informed and grounded in an actual understanding of the effectiveness of policy, sort of based on evidence. And this isn't something new. Planning authorities have long been monitoring housing delivery, but in the absence of sort of specific guidance on what information needs to be recorded, authorities have tended to treat the task of monitoring housing as one of a survey, really, to be completed in order to fill out a return or to provide data for a monitoring report. Now, unfortunately, that hasn't generated local data of sufficient quality or accuracy to enable the kind of analysis that we now sort of find necessary, particularly as we were writing this bid, anticipating the results of the first housing delivery test, really in relation to actually understanding that delivery. And so we thought that a longitudinal approach to monitoring sites, so tracking a site from first engagement with the planning system right through to completion and beyond, would be a far more effective way of delivering some of the insights which are needed to actually sort of get under the hood of housing delivery. Now, this could be from maximising the value of the various functions of the council. So we worked across many departments as part of this project, and the sort of data produced through these, or through drawing on other geospatial data, such as that from satellites. That was sort of our initial hypothesis, and is one which I think has broadly been borne out by the work which the Catapult and our other supplier teams have done. Now, I won't labour that too much more, because I think we get a really good sort of grounding in the project and the approach that was taken here. So I'll hand back over to Kate, Yusuf, and Dominika now to take you through the work that they've done. But we look forward to picking up any questions at the end. So over to you.
Thanks, Ollie. And Yusuf, Dominika, I can't see you, but I'm hoping that you are back on with your cameras on as well. So for the next half an hour, we're just going to do a condensed version of the final output of our work on the housing monitoring project. And today we're going to be covering, if you just want to go to the next slide, Yusuf, the context of the challenge and our approach to it, our understanding of the problem, and importantly, how it changed and moved as we went through the project, how we kind of defined and learnt more about the problem, and then our proposed solution. Before I kick off, next slide, there's going to be a term that you hear a lot through this presentation that you'll probably have also read a lot of press about recently, which is the acronym UPRN, a Unique Property Reference Number. And Yusuf's just going to give a quick definition for anyone that's not close to it, because we at the beginning of this project knew very little about them, just so everyone's got an understanding as we go through.
Yeah, so as Kate mentioned, a unique property reference number is basically an identifier for any addressable unit in the UK. So that could mean a house and it could mean a flat, but interestingly, it could also mean a block of flats. So we'll get into that more as we go on, but just need to keep in mind the UPRN is an ID number for any addressable location.
Cool. So next slide. So before we start, we just wanted to give a bit of an overview of why we think this project is really, really important, and we're really pleased that Waltham Forest have taken such an innovative approach to looking at it. So today we're in a housing crisis. Homelessness is increasing, house prices and rentals are becoming unaffordable to many. And yet we're building less homes than in 1964 and not hitting the targets we need to meet our housing needs. In fact, since we made this slide, conditions have worsened due to COVID, and the private sector is predicted to deliver just 10,000 new homes this year. Obviously, local plans, land use planning, and government interventions in the market are absolutely paramount to intervene in a crisis and change some of these statistics. Yet monitoring and learning whether they're having the impacts we intended is severely under-resourced, undervalued, and often characterized by inefficient methods that actually aren't possible at the moment, such as visiting sites on a bus. And I've done this in every job I've had in housing, apart from this one at CPC. And if we're truly to accelerate homes, we have to have better market intelligence of what's being built and why certain types of sites are coming forward and others aren't, so we can inform future plans. So our approach to this challenge has been designed to Agile service design standards. This is a key part of our approach at CPC, and around focusing on the real pain point first and testing our hypothesis before we come up with or fix on any solution. So for this project, we sought to build on a previous housing monitoring sprint we did, which the brilliant Nissa in my team ran, which identified the need to extend the remit of the monitoring officer over the full development lifecycle. So they weren't just looking at starts and completions, but the stages that were in between. And also look at the nuances of Waltham Forest and how they conducted this process. We also sought to understand the usability, trustworthiness, and technical feasibility of existing and external datasets before we prioritized any to look at. And we also wanted to ensure that any solution is both user-friendly and scalable to other local authorities. So this was key for us working with Atkins as part of this project and looking how we could integrate it as part of the London Development Database. And just quickly, just to flash up the team for this project, who you'll be hearing from at the end, it's just worth noting we put together a multidisciplinary team for this project, so we could be looking at testing the technical feasibility of any solution alongside desirability.
So like Kate mentioned, we started this project with the knowledge gathered through our previous work from the Plantech program and a vision of a problem to validate. And building on this previous experience, we conducted thorough user research with Waltham Forest and with external stakeholders, producing insights and running sprint to validate our insights and ideate on a potential solution. And in our previous work, we ran a sprint during which we reached out to all monitoring officers in the UK and managed to actually speak to 40 of them across the country. And some of our key insights included that monitoring officers are hacking the system to get and validate their data, that their objective is to collect data on starts and completions, that monitoring is undervalued and under-resourced, and that different data about the same development are not linked. So we went in thinking that we needed a tool, and so did London Borough of Waltham Forest. And back then we developed an idea for a potential solution that we could hopefully learn from in this project. But we understood early on that this is an opportunity for us to gather focused and granular insights about the actual practices of not only monitoring officers, but all the departments that are contributing to the journey of a development, and that no tool would be useful without understanding that bigger complexity. So this process was very important. We used very purposeful recruitment to secure our baseline interview list, and then used snowball and grapevine techniques to identify who those core users felt were the other core stakeholders. And we adopted a human-centered approach where the users were the experts of their network and their processes. And after analyzing the interviews, we identified key users of the monitoring data and then developed user profiles for 4 of them to further validate our understanding of their roles. So just to show them to you, we did a profile for a monitoring officer, for an infrastructure planning manager, for an LLPG custodian, and for a council tax officer as well. So through early research analysis, we discovered key insights about pain points and hopes of the key identified users. And we created sets of cards featuring those to use during the sprint, and later as prompts for stimulating discussion about the current stakeholder journey, gap analysis, and potential solution ideas. And based on the synthesis, we also created detailed process maps for each user that interacts with the monitoring officer, singling out key events and all the data inputs. And these allowed us to understand the complexity of interrelations of the actors within the council, the timelines of individual processes, and overlaps between the processes of different stakeholders. And those individual maps and further synthesis led us to mapping of the key events and touch points between all the involved stakeholders against the entire journey of a development. And we haven't seen such a map done before. So to visualize the processes and interactions graphically allowed us to really fully understand and visualize the user journey from planned, permitted, started, and to completed. We used this map to identify where data flowing through the course of the development were being created, used, and stored, and validated these findings during the sprint using cards that you can see on this picture. We then worked with Waltham Forest stakeholders to identify how this data is prioritized internally and externally, and discussed opportunities to introduce new data sources. And based on the previously mentioned hope and pain cards, we identified main issues with the process, covering themes like data reporting, inefficient formats, no tracking of changes throughout the development, or issues with data matching. And these were the actual problems that our team was interested in discovering, created collaboratively and affecting most of the users. And after analyzing these pain cards, we came up to kind of top 3 insights from synthesizing of the entire sprint. And we learned that successful monitoring is not only about accurately measuring starts and completions. We found out that the majority of in identified data sources originally come from Waltham Forest and are being sold back to them by third parties, that the most valuable data identified by users is being produced by building control, and that there is no shared identifier at a unit level, disabling the possibility to match the plans with actual progress of the development as it's being built.
So part 3, defining the problem. So halfway through the challenge process, we had a new hypothesis and understanding of the problem area. This was all about an approach to managing identifiers and linking different levels so that applications, for example, are actually linked to blocks, which are then linked to units, that better reflects the reality of the development process for these different levels, would allow us to link data that drives insight. We called this creating the golden thread of housing monitoring data. Because of this, we realized that a tool that simply bolts on to existing ways of working wouldn't solve the real problem we'd identified. So we refocused our efforts to validating this hypothesis and understanding the process and technical innovations that would be required to enable it. So to do this, we broke our hypothesis down into 4 key areas and tried to look at what were the riskiest assumptions underpinning it. So first of all, we wanted to understand, could we actually get unit level data into Waltham Forest earlier and store it? As without this, you actually wouldn't have the information to assign a unit level UPRN earlier. Secondly, can Waltham Forest assign and manage UPRNs earlier in the development process rather than waiting until developments are nearly complete, as this normally doesn't happen until street naming and numbering, which can be years down the line for a big development. Thirdly, does doing this enable us to link different data sources and create the golden thread we've been talking about? And finally, and actually most importantly, does the data we can link and that we've enabled through this actually give us the insight we need to accelerate the delivery of homes?
So why is it so important to get this unit level data in earlier? And it's because of what we call this smoothie problem. So if you don't get unit level data in earlier, you just can't get it back. So if we have the example of a smoothie, you take very discrete and separate fruits and you blend them all together, and that's quite easy. If you took a smoothie and you tried to turn that into the separate fruits, that's very difficult, pretty much impossible. And it's similar to the problem we see in housing monitoring. Our data comes in looking like 17 2-bedroom apartments. So if a 2-bedroom apartment completed, we wouldn't know which one of the 17 it was. And that's because we don't capture this information early enough. We need to identify a unit before it has been completed, and then we can start this golden thread. But we had some good news. Developers, funnily enough, did record this information. And this is in the form of an accommodation schedule, which is an Excel spreadsheet, which has unit by unit breakdown with information such as bedrooms, tenure type, size, and other attributes. So we met with the GLA and the Atkins LDD development team. Everyone's really motivated to try and capture this data earlier and ensure that the new gen LDD schema could capture it earlier. Atkins were also able to draw on their LDD work to propose the required changes to processes to capture an accommodation schedule in earlier. So this is all quite good news, but an accommodation schedule isn't exactly the same as all of them. So a formalization of an accommodation schedule is required.
Okay, so once we got this unit level data in, could we assign and manage UPRNs earlier? So we spent a lot of time, which we have to say a big thank you to them, with the local land and property gazetteer custodian at Waltham Forest. And what we learned is there is more than possible to assign and manage UPRNs earlier through employing what's known as a provisional UPRN. It just hadn't been explored before. And we also, through this, learned and mapped the workflow change required to do it. And we also, as part of this, confirmed the possibility for this to be automated through the technical feasibility of SatMap, which is the system used to assign UPRNs, being able to push these to both the LDD and the gazetteer to store and manage them. As part of this work, we also went out and spoke to other organisations looking at UPRNs to learn from them, such as MHCLG, Land Registry, Geospatial Commission, and other local authorities. I think there were two big learnings from this work. The first one that was, despite the work to open up UPRNs, not all of the research and work out there had realised when they are assigned and the barriers to linking data this presents of anything that becomes before street naming and numbering. And for those that had, such as Land Registry, sometimes it was hard to have the remit to prove that the benefits outweighed the efforts for local authorities. They were really interested in the output of this work.
So to identify useful data sources that would give us information over the progress of a development, during the sprint, we brought together multiple people in Waltham Forest, data scientists, and our partners from the satellite catapult. This group were able to identify the most accessible and trusted sources of data, of which a key finding was most useful data was held within the council. So internal data is really important here, but it couldn't be joined together because departments operate at different stages of a development and also different granularities, so at a block level or at an individual unit level. So we worked closely with Ollie and Building Control and to confirm if Building Control could capture this data and enrich the housing monitoring view of a development. We also designed a process that will enable provisional UPRNs to be used by Building Control, enabling them to link their data.
Okay, so finally, we wanted to learn, can we actually learn from the data this process and technology innovation has enabled? So to do this, we went out there and we spoke to experts in housing that also monitor homes to talk them through our hypothesis and the data our solution enabled us to link. And really interestingly, we learned that housing monitoring is an issue across housing and there's a real appetite for change. We also developed a long list of use cases for our solution and how it could automate monitoring and accelerate homes. And we tested these again with people working in housing. And we learned that there's a particular appetite in having interest and access to the data enabled, given its level of granularity about a development status without anyone that doesn't need to visit that site actually visiting it. This enables really early intervention in sites that stall and a greater understanding of what point they hit problems and potentially why. There was also a real interest in the ability to learn from the intelligence gained from tracking units over time and how this could be used to inform better predictions. Finally, it also demonstrated there were use cases beyond housing, showing the commercial utility of the solution. At the end of this, we also worked with Waltham Forest users and prioritised 3 use cases that met their needs for a deeper dive to try and understand how they might appear in Waltham Forest and any preconditions and exceptions. So at the end of this phase, 3 things really stood out for us. Firstly, we revalidated our insight from earlier in the project. There's hugely valuable data being generated across the council in BAU, but often people in BAU roles don't see the data as having a wider impact, so it's not being treated as an asset. Interestingly, other councils were in the same position, and those exploring this area hadn't quite cracked it yet. And back office system providers had clearly tried to use identifiers, but to suit their own business process. So without thinking about how this maps into the wider context of other systems, and then where the information might be used outside of their own system. So what did this mean for our solution? Firstly, users aren't extracting insight that could be invaluable for monitoring, and therefore there's a continued reliance on third-party data. So our solution really needed to treat data as an asset and remove this need. Secondly, this is clearly a shared problem, which provided evidence that a solution around this could be novel and scalable. And finally, and again, most importantly, that without fixing this plumbing, no monitoring tool would actually work. And I think this is really relevant, again, back to the UPRN report and UPRN work and reports out there at the moment. That it's amazing that they've been made open. But there still remains this problem that UPRNs aren't being applied early enough in the process to really capture their value.
Right, so what's the solution? Our solution aims to shift processes and technologies so data is treated as an asset. So in practice, this means each department's output is treated as an input for another department. A building control completion certificate will notify council tax that that unit is likely to be occupied soon. So by taking care and storing data in this way, we can enable data science tools. Our reuse of data is not adding another form to fill out or paying third-party contractors to go out. It's using data generated as part of this business as usual process. This also enables these siloed departments to understand where they sit in terms of accelerating housing delivery. And this is all encompassed in our microservices approach, small functional components that communicate through APIs. Here we can build this platform for new modules and new innovations to spring up, increasing our understanding. This quote, I don't think is as fashionable now, but it talks about how if you don't measure something, you can't understand it. And I think that's true of housing monitoring. Kate's always telling us, how does what we're doing accelerate monitoring housing? But we don't even understand the current rate of housing. We don't understand the current build out rates accurately enough. So before any credible attempt to accelerate housing can be made, we need to be able to measure it accurately. And that's what we intend to do. This is a kind of high level view of how we're going to do it. 3 stages. The first stage is getting all the useful information in and managing it. Then we have a store stage where you can make that data accessible and aggregate it. And then the load stage, giving that data and the insights to people who require it. I just want to emphasize here the pyramid structure of this solution. It's so important that we get the data quality in the get stage, and that enables us to climb up the pyramid. So when we do organize and store this data properly, we can track homes, we can share this information across departments, we can measure build out rates accurately, make more accurate forecasts and predictions, and also look at interventions based on identifying bottlenecks. So the first part of the get stage is tackling this smoothie problem head on. You know, it's well understood that you shouldn't blend your fruit because you lose the fiber. Well, we lose valuable unit level information. So we're going to get an accommodation schedule in earlier and also work to formalize a structure of them. But again, this is business as usual for developers. They have this accommodation schedule and we're just treating it as an input into our process. This gives us more granular information earlier, which can give us insights such as what kind of development mix completes quicker, which tenures are switched the most, and affordability. The second part of the get solution, when we get this unit level information in, we have to manage these identifiers better. We spent a lot of time understanding UPRNs, and the gazetteer custodian at Waltham Forest was so generous with their time. But it's difficult, right? It's a difficult job to track something that changes so much throughout its lifetime. So because of this, currently UPRNs are assigned near the end, so when they're about to finish. But this makes it difficult to forecast, and we lose all that information pre-completion. So we've gone to great lengths to design a process that can enable provisional UPRNs, which can be used before a unit is completed. This will allow other departments, such as Building Control, Section 106, to use these identifiers. And this is a process change as much as a technical. So I spoke about how we prioritize data within the council. This stage is essentially capturing that data, not imposing our requirements on existing processes. Again, this microservice approach, do one thing and do it well. SIL software should be really good for SIL, and we don't want to add another form or add extra reporting to that module. We just want to use the data they generated to enhance our system. And I'll go over this quickly. I understand not everyone is gets as excited as me about databases, but essentially we're just gathering all this data together and making it accessible. We have two proposals. So I'll just go through the first one here from top left. The application comes in, gets pulled into the LDD, and then we pull it into our proprietary database that is owned by the council. From here, an application is assigned provisional UPRNs via the Gazetteer software, then manually exported every week in weekly reports to our database and the local Gazetteer. This is important because Geoplace, who administer the UPRNs, do not want provisional status UPRNs because they are subject to change. They only want to know what's going to happen. So our local Gazetteer will then hold these provisional UPRNs, enabling building control, Section 106, council tax to use these identifiers so we can share this information. The second option essentially uses the LDD as a centralized data store. The LDD is built on some really cool tech. It's called Elasticsearch, used by Tinder, but it's really flexible and essentially schemaless by nature. So it's really applicable and able to store our monitoring needs. Then finally, we have reached the top of the pyramid. Dominique will be expanding on this, but this stage is building accessible APIs, web interfaces to allow the people who need this data to access it. So now the data scientist, the data analyst can come to the fore. We have a rich data set upon which predictions and data-led interventions can be based. And we've come to the end of that quote. We've measured housing delivery, and now we can understand it and take steps to accelerate delivery. I think you're on mute, Dominica. That's one for the Zoom bingo there.
So how might this interface look like? We created mock-up screens of this hypothetical tool that could be used by multiple stakeholders, and we based it on 3 separate user stories based on the user needs that we identified and prioritized in the process. But please bear in mind that what we will present is not yet a proposal of a final product, but more of a visualization of how a queryable platform like this could work. And due to time, I'll only be able to present some of the screens that we prepared. So here we focus on use cases of the monitoring officer and the current lack of possibility to view developments at a ward level. So this solution allows to browse by wards and to filter by the type and tenure of home and place it against the targets. In this screen, it shows an overview of an entire development, at the same time allowing browsing by specific unit to monitor its progress and specific data events and data inputs that happen throughout the development. It gives an overview of the data events that the units go through, as well as displaying an accumulated progress of the entire development and calculates a predicted stage of completion. This screen, which was based on the use case of an infrastructure planning manager, so somebody who's from outside of the council but uses the monitoring data in their work, allows to see the targets versus actual completions for the past 5 years, and providing explanations to why the actual numbers are different, which schemes affected them, and the reason behind them. And it also shows the predicted amount of completions against the targets. And in this screen, which is based on the case of the council tax officer, this interface allows a selection of a particular data event, which results in the list of all the units or the developments that already completed the stage in a given quarter. So for example, council tax officer, to understand the workload that awaits for them in a given period, needs to know how many units have been issued a building control 2 certificate, which means that the units are ready for occupation. So by selecting building control 2, we can see the amount and a list of units with such certificate, allowing to plan council taxes workflow and increasing transparency. In the next screen, if the officer is interested in surveying a specific area, there is also an option to the map allowing to select the territory they're interested in and displaying it all the local schemes under development. Accordingly, it can also be filtered by a data event to allow more granular and more focused data. And over to Kate.
Thank you. So thanks, everyone. If you've got any questions directly on this presentation that we don't cover today, we will email around after this event and share our contact details. If you want to get in touch, if you want to learn more, I saw there was a request for a glossary, which we're happy to send out because I know there's lots of acronyms. We're now going to have about 15-20 minutes to ask question and answers to the project team. So we've got the whole project team here today. We've also got Angus and Colin joining us from Atkins, who you haven't seen yet. And we're also lucky to have Jane, who's a director of planning at Waltham Forest, with us as well for this part of the session. So I'll now hand over to Aisling. If all of the Q&A guys could turn their cameras on, and Aisling will be picking up your questions to the speakers.
Hello. So the first question I have is actually for Jane. So for other local authorities considering becoming challenge owners through GovTech Catalyst programme, what kind of advice would you give them?
That's a hard one. I think it's been a particularly good project because unlike some of these things where you come up with a solution yourself, the concept of the catalyst was for the suppliers to develop solutions to our problem. So I think that was sort of a really good way to look at this. I think it's taught us a lot really about how different parts of the council don't work as effectively together as they could. But I think Ollie would probably agree, as we've gone through the project, we've kind of sort of gone through peaks and troughs of thinking, oh, this was a really good idea, and then the amount of work that it required at different points. I think, why on earth did we ever do this? Because it really did take a lot of resources from the team. So I think maybe that's the key piece of advice that I would give, is just think about how you're going to resource it if you're successful.
That's great, thank you. So Yusuf, I've got one, I think it's probably for you. So the question came in from Martin. Is it true that you can't accelerate house building until you track the data? Is that true, basically?
It's not true, no. I think data is a really big part of it. As Aisling has taught me, actually, it's part of a bigger process of cultural change. And we spoke a lot about understanding how your role impacts the wider role. So no, it's not data only, but good practices, storing that data, making it accessible, can give you access to these machine learning methods and things like that. So no, not data by itself, but before any kind of new tech and machine learning can be put in, you need to build that quality data underneath it. So yeah.
And while you're unmuted, because I know this is something that came up a lot for us as a point of discussion during the whole project. So building control is not only a council function. What about making change happen for approved inspectors? This might also be Kate, because I can see Kate smirking a little bit at this one.
I'll leave this one to Kate.
Thanks, Yusuf. Yeah, so that came up quite a lot in our research, that obviously public building control is only part of the picture. We prioritise it for this project, or this part of the project, but we also looked into NHBC data, which Waltham Forest already receive, which does pick up a lot of schemes that are going through the private inspector group. So if there was a future phase of this project, we would definitely be looking at that as part of this. I think the other thing to note that we heard from a lot of developers was following the Hackett review and the refocus on building safety information and the gateway and stage gate process. They were starting actually to review using private building control inspectors, and we're expecting to put more of their work through the public building control process.
Thanks. So this is, again, this could be Kate or Yusuf. I think a lot of these questions are going to end up being for the two of you. So there's a question around kind of, well, I'm paraphrasing two questions here, but there's a question around getting accommodation schedules from developers. How amenable were they to sharing them? And how can we ensure through future processes that we're going to be able to capture that information?
Yeah, do you want me to go first, and then Yusuf, you can add? So accommodation schedules, when we spoke to a couple of developers, are already in existence at the point they get to planning permission, particularly detailed planning permission. I saw the question on the outlined one. So it's a piece of information that already exists, albeit in lots of different forms. It's just never been asked for at planning permission stage before. So most are amenable. We'd be really keen, and I think they're on this actually, to join up with DXW to understand actually a bit more about the outcome of, they've been testing accommodation schedules as part of the affordable housing monitoring project at Southwark. And again, I think have found that developers are amenable to providing that information. The appropriate point for submission would need to be tested as part of the next phase of at what point does it stop changing so much.
Yeah, as just to reiterate what Kate mentioned, it is already being handed over in more informal kind of emails and things like that later on in the process. So I think just pushing this back and bringing this earlier is definitely possible.
Great. And another one for Kate on the kind of definition differences in terms of starts, completions between building control and planning, and in general, all of the stakeholders who we were mapping as part of this process. Did that kind of impact? Yeah,
so that's actually one of the slides we hid, and it came out in our midpoint presentation, is one of our big findings. And I found it, having worked for kind of Homes England, different housing associations, is there is not one definition of completion across different departments, different regulators, and also nationally. I think we found about 27 different definitions in statistics. So the solution that we proposed tried to reflect this. So what it's trying to do is show how development moves through different data points rather than saying this is definitely complete. And then you can use those data points to inform whichever definition of completion you are using as a department, because we get actually that planning completion is earlier than, for example, building control completion often.
Cool. I think this is a really interesting one, not one that I feel confident enough to take by myself, but Zach from Quad asked, we speak about the accommodation schedule, going back to accommodation schedules, as being a key component of getting the information, but no two schedules look the same and they're updated as we progress through the process. So what kind of problems do we foresee as part of the formalization of that? And would architects be expected to formalize their work, or would it be on the local authority to do that? Yusuf, I think this is your one.
Was it me? I saw Ollie nodding as well, but no. Yeah, thanks, Zach. I think you're right. It's not exactly the same, but as we mentioned, for large-scale developments, it is a necessary piece of information for multiple council departments. So there is definitely a requirement to keep that information updated. So formalising that in a way that works for everyone, including developers, not just the council departments, I think is the thing everyone's motivated to do. So in terms of problems, obviously, people don't want increased burden of updates, but if you make a solution where you can track changes and you don't have to start again, I think this was the biggest pain point we found, is that you've sent an accommodation schedule, now you have to remake a new one that's updated. If we can just continually update information, it's less burdensome and probably easier to change that process.
I was nodding a little bit, Yusuf. I think it's not necessary that we expect all the information that you have from your architect in their version of the accommodation schedule at every point, but certainly, and this also touches on the point about, would we have an accommodation schedule for an outline application? I think at the point that we've we're submitting detailed planning, we should have an accommodation schedule, and then at the point that that is approved, we should have another one. Whether that's owned, who that's owned by, there is still something to be worked out, but through those 2 points, I think we'd be able to cover all of the information as an input to any system of monitoring that we'd want. And I would just note that we sort of bracketed the question of all of the inputs as part of this project. We're aware that there are lots of really great Plantech kind of projects out there which are taking their view of the world as being that whole journey from starting a planning application to getting approval for it. We were sort of trying to work in this building block modular kind of way and say, well, we'll tackle this bit of the problem and approach it in a way that means that we can maximize the value that we get when we know more about what it is that we're talking about.
Thanks, Ollie. While you're unmuted, do you think this project will reduce the need for planners to visit sites to monitor site completions?
Yeah, that's one of the aims. I mean, I think for us as an urban authority in London, it's not too problematic. We're sort of 38 square kilometres, something like that. If you're up in Scotland and your monitoring area is the whole of the Highlands, then obviously going out on site in addition to all of the other interactions that are happening would be an additional burden that wouldn't be necessary. We're not suggesting that no one needs to go on site. We're just suggesting that if we take this view of the whole development process rather than it being chunked up into little bits and distributed out to different teams, different departments, we can know what the optimal amount of interaction from the council as a whole is with the project, and not basically just not duplicate effort.
Yeah, I believe that very profoundly. Colin, hello. I have a question here from someone who says they're an ex-colleague of yours. Could you give an overview of the GIS setup of the process?
Yeah, so I mean, in a sense, the LDD side of this process, the index is it's an Elasticsearch index, and what that means is we take all of the information related to the planning application and we've compressed it into a single document, a JSON document. And that document contains a lot of data, a lot of information, but it also has the ability to hold either the point location of the property or site that the planning application refers to, or it can hold a polygon boundary. And then within the LDD, there is a dashboarding function that we can use. And then within that dashboard, there's the ability to generate maps and filter results based on the area that's selected. So that could be a borough, for example. You could filter everything by the borough. That would give you all the points. And as you zoom in, you can get to the polygons. Then what we're looking at doing at the next stage is integrating outputs from the LDD into the wider GLA GIS estate. So looking to publish data to the IMA, for example, the infrastructure mapping solution that's online, and a number of other internal GLA GIS systems too.
Great, thank you. Someone rang a doorbell, so I muted myself for a second. So I've had a couple of questions about, have we thought about how the data could be used to predict future completions, forecast future completions? And I think it's something that the whole team considered as part of the process, but Kate might be best placed to answer this one.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So yeah, predictions was something we definitely thought about, because I think as we went through the project, we started to learn that the success of housing monitoring was more than just knowing starts and completions. It was about having better data to inform infrastructure planning, to plan for income, and that all involved having better data for forecasts and predictions. And I think some of the screens Dominica showed tried to illustrate that. So we definitely have thought about it, and perhaps Tamar can chime in from a data sense, but from a housing sense, having such granular data of where different schemes of different types and different types of units, how long they're taking to get through a series of data events as they're being developed, means that over time you can start to learn from that data and to be able to predict how similar developments might take to get through that process.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. All I would add to that really is that to me, the major benefit of what we identified here around UPRNs not being assigned early enough is such an enabler for building up that kind of that effectively more complete understanding of what actually happens as a development progresses, so that we have that data available to look at and kind of section off for different kinds of housing, so that we can start to learn, for example, where bottlenecks are for particular bits of delivery. Say if there's a kind of a new development coming up that's of a particular type that we've seen before, and we have the data that's tracked those developments before, then we can make much better predictions using lots of standard statistical methods. And really it's about having the joint up data to enable that.
Great, thank you very much. So Tamar and Yusuf, this one I think it might be for you. It kind of speaks to, can we add different or other types of data or more data earlier in the process? So does this kind of mechanism facilitate that?
I think the very clear answer is yes, absolutely. I think the way we've kind of described UPRNs fitting into the process earlier and enabling this kind of golden thread of information is a framework that a lot more could be hung on top of, and the opening up of UPRNs is really, really critical to that. We explored a few different ideas during the project, like for example satellite data sitting on top of that and things like this, and I think again that kind of golden thread is an enabler for more additions, but we decided that some of the data that local authorities already held was the highest priority stuff, and the users helped us prioritize that. Yusuf, would you add anything?
No, yeah, I think it's a great point on the satellite. And also when we did wider research, we found that other councils look for different signals. So we didn't want to put, okay, satellite data for everyone. It's actually built in a way where you can use the most useful signals. Data availability is different in different regions. So we've built it in a way where you can add on these IoT sensors, satellite data, bin collection data into the process to make it more custom for each borough.
There have been a couple of questions come in about kind of the commercial opportunities that that a tool or a process like this could present. And it was something we considered, obviously, as part of the project. But Kate and maybe Angus, do you want to speak to those a little bit, like commercial opportunities and potential income streams?
Yeah, I'll pass over to Angus in a minute for this one. But yeah, we looked at use cases within housing and how you could look at treating data as an asset and potentially looking at how could you, the value of combining lots of local authority data and selling insights from that data. And also looked at other industries such as utilities, who also really suffer and hit huge inefficiencies from poor data to plan housing. And there was I think we see this as acting the data, almost creating a platform for other use cases and looking at the commercial offer around those. I don't know if Angus, you want to add anything?
Yes, yeah, thanks, Kate. We produced a 5-point business case looking into this in detail. We considered the viability of deploying the solution within Waltham Forest, also scaling to other planning authorities, and then to consider the potential commercial opportunities that expanding data set would present to other sectors that Kate referenced there, some regulated utilities and also the private sector. So through in-depth interviews with Waltham Forest and also other planning authorities, including Cambridge and Aylesbury, we took the approach of understanding the cost of the status quo for acquiring, processing, validating, updating data, and also some of the inefficiencies that are currently caused by the status quo. Another benefit area that was identified was the ability to capture revenue that was associated with new development, and also some of the benefits around policy and planning. The conclusion of the commercial case was that at the local level, the deployment of the solution within Waltham Forest and to extend to other authorities was self-financing through existing local authority funding pots. We identified the fact that there'd be the need for some capital funding to fund changes to systems, and also some revenue funding to fund process change. And identified the funding pots that would be applicable to that. So we certainly identified that there's a really attractive benefit cost ratio associated with providing the service. And then we did some further in-depth discovery with regulated utilities, again to understand the cost associated with the status quo, the potential value afforded to them. And we produced a range, because it's different from one utility to the other. We produced a range of different costs currently borne by the status quo. And again, the conclusion there was that the benefit cost ratio associated with this kind of service is really favourable.
Thanks very much. This one is maybe a little bit more straightforward, but it's something I do not know the answer to, so I'm going to put it to Ali. What supplier do the London Borough of Waltham Forest use for your planning application management?
Currently, we use Civica APP, but we're moving to Tascomi over the course of the next few months. Jane may be able to add any more detail on the decision of why that was, but we expect to be onboarded with Tascomi hopefully by the end of the summer. So that's the sort of context. But I think when the GLA did their discovery of who was using what for their LDD work, I think we were the one pink authority who was using a supplier that no one had heard of, at least in planning.
This is a very interesting question that kind of speaks to, as part of the project that we did a very large process redesign, looking at the kind of individual roles that and individual tasks that people would have to engage in order to make this process work or make this new system work. But the question is, how can we ensure that we have the UPRNs in place at the right time? And is it entirely dependent on having the accommodation schedule available? And so I think Tamar and Yusuf, but I'm happy to jump into this one as well.
So I think that the three kind of bits of the hypothesis that we were really testing at the midpoint were centered around, like, can we get the accommodation schedule in a standardized machine readable form earlier, and that's certainly been the kind of source of unit level information that we've been focused on. So I see those two bits as really quite connected. We did quite a lot of investigation across different local authorities, as well as working with Waltham Forest around when that unit level, those unit level identifiers were actually applied. Might be worth Yusuf, you saying a bit more about that.
I'm so sorry. I was trying to answer the questions on the typing, but
No, that's right. I was just saying it might be worth talking about the conversations you had with different local authorities to understand where unit level identifiers were currently applied and how kind of common that problem was, and whether we thought we could use accommodation schedules.
Yeah, so I think it's a common problem solved in many different ways. So if you are in a borough where there's not lots of development, you can kind of count it in your head and you can keep track of it. So that's why there is this differing, it's not ubiquitous, this solution already. But in terms of the original question, using accommodation schedule, we find that's the least burdensome way to get that unit level data in earlier, and it's already being done. So we want to collect in data that's already being generated. So I'm sure there are other ways, but we find this is the kind of least path of resistance to change.
Yep. Thank you very much. So another one, I'm not sure we're going to have the most satisfying answer to this one, but I think it's a very interesting question. So for unit tracking, what do we do on an outline accommodation, an outline application where the schedule of accommodation is not known? It might be up to N dwellings, might change, be phased, modified over lots of different reserved matters. So what do we do where we don't have a lot of information, let's say?
Yeah, just quickly, we try and put in as much as we do know. So we know there's uncertainty so early on. The whole point is capturing that uncertainty and watching how it changes. Ollie was speaking a lot about how his plans change. So if there's a plan and we think it's 50, it's really important that we know next year it's 20. Yeah. So we want to capture that uncertainty. And speaking to Colin as well, Elasticsearch is schemaless. We'll also use another very flexible database to be able to capture all these oddly shaped bits of data.
Great. And there's a question which is coming from Justin, which is what's next for the concept? What comes next? What are we proposing we do with this going forward? Kate, I'm going to put this to you. I think we all have opinions, but I'm going to put it to you, Kate.
I think it's a really good question. We'd love to continue working with Waltham Forest. This is putting them on the spot, but we're still waiting to hear the outcome of who's going to be invited to tender for the next stage. We're also, in our role as the Catapult, want to create things that are scalable and have change across other local authorities. So we're really keen to make this work open, partner with others. So we'd be keen to join up with other projects that are similar to this, and look for other ways to kind of roll the learning out as well. So we don't want this to kind of be held into us now. We do want to make it open and see if these learnings can be applied elsewhere, because I think the use of provisional UPRNs has real benefits.
Great. Quick question for Colin. When will the LDD automation project go live?
Plans are changing slightly as a result of the COVID-19 situation. Current plan is to go live end of June with local boroughs. So that's helping to get them connected up into the system so that data can be fed through. And then possibly, I guess within a few weeks after that, there will be a public-facing version of the dataset. So one of the goals of the LDD project is to have a mirrored copy of the LDD database that's publicly accessible through an API that anybody will be able to access freely. And the plan for that will be to follow on, so probably mid to late July, that sort of time frame. But at the moment, those things are subject to a bit of flux with the current situation.
Cool. I think we might be coming up to the end of our time. Just very quickly, one last summary question, or one last question that I'm particularly interested in the answer to is, there's a question about how this could be used in other parts of the planning process, how this kind of process, but also there's another question about how it could be used in other parts of the council. Yusuf, I imagine you have opinions on this, but I'm going to put it to Ollie.
Well, I think we initially scoped this when we wrote the bid as a whole monitoring piece rather than specifically about housing. But we didn't want to sort of bite off more than we could chew. So we focused on housing in this case, but we were just having discussions about last week about how this could possibly be adapted to monitor other land use changes. And I think the foundation that we're building from here is really strong. So you could do all of your retail monitoring, all of your industrial monitoring sort of through this as well. But I'd ask, anyone's thoughts on the extension of this to chime in.
Just quickly, keep it modular, keep it flexible, and I think this approach here embeds in the current systems. And I think that general rule is what we're trying to do at Catapult from a tech point.
Great. Thank you all very much. Thank you for answering the questions, and thanks to everyone for answering. We unfortunately didn't get through all the questions, so we will do our best to answer the rest of them in writing. So yeah, thank you so much for participating. It was very exciting and good.
Great.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Ashley. And just a huge thanks to all the speakers. Thank you, Waltham Forest, for letting us be part of the project. And thank you for Atkins for joining us today. We're running over slightly, so I'll just be really quick. Just to let you know, we've got a number of other upcoming webinars, which you can see on the screen. So we've got a really interesting one coming up next on autonomous vehicles. There's also a support and networking webinar on the 17th of June. And then finally, a third Thursday, which I think is at a revised time, which will notify you all of about seizing Singapore's opportunities. So thanks again to everyone for joining, to all the speakers. We'll endeavour to answer the questions afterwards. And we'll also send around our contact details, Waltham Forest and the Catalyst, so you've got them. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.